As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles, which have meant so much to me. He succeeds me as Duke of
As his heir, Prince Alaric now stood closer to a throne he had not yet been asked to claim. King Edmund did not summon the nation, stand before the cameras, or deliver a grand address. Instead, behind a locked door at Thornhelm Castle, he lifted a black fountain pen and signed a document so sensitive that only 3 sealed copies were permitted to exist. Its subject was Alaric's coronation, and the decision written inside it would permanently alter the future of the Aldermere crown. Edmund entered his private study at night, carrying his decision. His constitutional secretary waited beside the keeper of the Privy Seal, the official who guards the monarch's most sensitive state documents. The doors were locked. A red dispatch box rested unopened between them. The king broke the seal. Inside lay a succession instrument, a binding royal order beginning preparations for Alaric's coronation while Edmund remained alive and sovereign. It did not remove the monarch or force immediate abdication. Instead, it fixed a ceremonial date window, granted the prince authority over his own crowning, and blocked palace factions from delaying the transition. When Edmund reached the page bearing Alaric's name, he stopped. His fingers tightened around the pen, because this was no longer procedure. A father was admitting that his son's hour had arrived, while part of him still struggled to accept what that meant for his own reign. Queen Consort Isolde learned of the meeting only after the final seal had been pressed into place. She stood outside the study as an aide confirmed that she had not been consulted. Her face hardened. The decision would shape her position and her influence. Yet the door had closed before she could speak. The most sensitive clauses remained hidden. One ordered a ceremony built around service and restraint, in memory of Alaric's late mother, Queen Elara. Another barred anyone outside the direct line of succession from controlling the coronation council, the body assigned to plan the ceremony. Isolde's authority was suddenly uncertain, and the courtiers who had expected influence found themselves pushed aside before the contest had even begun. Edmund signed the final page, placed the pen beside the red box, and said quietly, "There must be no confusion when the hour comes." The secretary sealed the document before anyone spoke. Before dawn, a private messenger was ordered to carry one copy directly to Alaric, who had no idea his father had already designed the beginning of his reign. When the sealed envelope finally reached him, the shock was not simply that his coronation had been planned. It was what his father expected him to accept before he could wear the crown. For the public, a coronation is a spectacle of gold, vows, and ancient ceremony. For Alaric, the sealed document was something far more painful, proof that his father had begun preparing for an ending neither man had spoken aloud. As he read the first page beside his wife, Princess Wren, the future king discovered that the crown was moving toward him faster than duty, family, or grief had allowed him to admit. Alaric received the envelope at Ashgrove House before breakfast. The courier asked for his signature, waited until the sealed copy rested firmly in his hands, and departed without a single explanation. The prince carried it inside with growing unease, because private deliveries from the palace did not arrive without purpose, and this one bore the weight of a decision already made. He broke the seal beside Wren and read the opening clause twice. A coronation framework was the official plan governing the ceremony, its advisors, and the transfer of responsibilities surrounding a future sovereign. Accepting it would move him beyond the role of supportive heir. He would become an active sovereign in waiting, carrying new authority while his father still occupied the throne, before either man had publicly acknowledged the change. Wren watched confusion leave her husband's face and disbelief take its place. She felt pride in the man he had become. Yet fear rose just as quickly. Alaric's elevation would also pull their son, young Prince Callum, closer to the crown, placing the boy beneath the same pressure his father had carried after his own mother's death. Success for one generation could become suffering for the next. Wren reached across the table and placed her hand over the pages. "Did your father warn you?" she asked. Alaric looked toward the window before answering. Not with words. The reply exposed years of emotional distance between the king and the son, expected to continue his reign. Alaric turned another page and discovered that Edmund had named him joint supervisor of all coronation planning, the power to reject traditions, appointments, and ceremonial roles before any transition occurred. Then came the sharper blow. He had 72 hours to provide written acceptance. Silence would not delay the process. Silence would count as consent. His father had deliberately closed every path of avoidance. Isolde received her notification at Larkspur House soon afterward. She read the two-line message beside an untouched tea tray, folded the paper once, and asked why Alaric had been informed before her. No second explanation arrived. Alaric remained at the table, questioning why his father had acted with such urgency. He did not yet know that one humiliating incident months earlier had convinced the king that succession could no longer remain an unwritten understanding. The answer lay not in the document itself, but in a ceremony where a single unexpected interruption had exposed how dangerously divided the palace had already become. The secret coronation order did not begin with a lawyer, a medical warning, or a constitutional debate. It began during a ceremony that should have displayed royal unity before senior courtiers and invited dignitaries. A small change to Alaric's seating position triggered a confrontation so public, so humiliating, and so revealing that Edmund later called it the moment he understood the crown could fracture before it ever reached his son. 6 months earlier, Edmund entered the planning chamber at Thornhelm, expecting order. Senior relatives and court officials had gathered to approve the procession, seating, and ceremonial precedents for the year ahead. The Order of the Lantern, an ancient gathering honoring the kingdom's highest order of chivalry, depended on position because every place silently announced rank, trust, and authority. Alaric had been instructed to sit beside his father. The change appeared small, yet everyone understood its meaning. The prince was no longer being treated only as the heir waiting behind the king. He was being shown as the man already preparing to carry more of the monarch's burden. Alaric entered and stopped. His chair had been moved away from Edmund, while Isolde's place had been restored directly beside the sovereign. A senior court official had made the alteration after a private discussion with the queen consort's household, but no approval had come from the king. Alaric refused to sit. He said nothing, yet his stillness exposed the insult more clearly than anger could have done. The future king remained standing as courtiers glanced toward one another, understanding that the rearrangement was deliberate and that everyone present had been forced to witness it. Edmund demanded to know who had authorized the change. Isolde answered that it was only a matter of ceremonial balance. She insisted her place beside her husband protected continuity, but the monarch heard a deeper message beneath her words. Alaric's growing authority was being challenged before it had even been formally defined. Edmund gripped the back of his son's displaced chair. He dragged it across the floor himself and placed it beside his own. The harsh sound silenced the chamber. Isolde watched without moving while Alaric finally sat, not in triumph, but with the cold restraint of someone who knew the conflict had only begun. Edmund received a documented briefing that evening, revealing draft succession plans circulating between rival households. The papers proposed competing roles, titles, and powers after his reign. Without a signed framework, Alaric's accession could be delayed, manipulated, or privately negotiated at the exact moment the kingdom needed certainty most. Edmund sat alone afterward, studying a photograph of himself with his son. He admitted to his private secretary that he had waited too long to define the future. The chair had exposed more than wounded pride. It had revealed a monarchy already dividing around a crown that had not yet changed hands. Alaric would soon learn exactly what had happened, and his response would be immediate. That meeting would not be conducted through secretaries or ceremonial language, because he entered Thornhelm determined to ask his father the one question Edmund had hoped to avoid. Alaric arrived carrying the signed document in his own hand. He refused the waiting equerry, passed the private secretary without stopping, and entered his father's study alone. Edmund was standing beside the window when the door closed. There were no advisors, no constitutional experts, and no prepared statements. Only a father who had made an irreversible decision, and a son demanding to know whether love or fear had driven it. Alaric placed the succession instrument on the desk. He understood its force. What he did not understand was why his father had acted so quickly, or why secrecy had mattered more than trust. "Are you preparing to leave?" Alaric asked, "or pushing me forward because you no longer trust the people around you?" The question struck deeper than either man expected. Edmund stiffened because both possibilities carried truth. He had begun planning for an ending, and he had lost faith in those already circling his son's future. Edmund accused him of treating preparation as betrayal. Alaric answered that a coronation was not an administrative handover. It would change Ren's life, reshape Callum's future, and touch every private relationship he still possessed. The future king had spent years learning how duty could consume a family. He would not pretend that another crown could arrive without another cost. Edmund pulled a chair toward him, but Alaric remained standing. The king removed his glasses and placed them on top of the document. Then he admitted that palace households had already begun fighting over his son's reign before the ink had dried. He spoke more quietly. He feared hesitation would leave Alaric surrounded by factions at the most vulnerable moment of his life. His voice broke when he said he refused to let his son inherit confusion alongside the crown. The confession did not erase the secrecy, but it changed its meaning. Alaric opened the document again and found powers he had not fully understood. He could dismantle the existing coronation committee and appoint advisors of his own choosing. Several long-serving courtiers would lose the influence they had expected. Edmund then admitted he had signed before Isolde could challenge the restrictions placed on non-heirs. She had been excluded because secrecy was not merely procedure, it was protection against resistance already forming inside the palace. Alaric did not reject the order. He demanded one condition instead. Ren must be included in every decision affecting their children. Edmund agreed, but warned that his signature was only part of the structure. Behind the dramatic act stood a strategist whose loyalty was not to Edmund, Isolde, or even Alaric personally, but to the survival of the crown itself. For weeks, Princess Rosalind, Edmund's sister, had moved quietly between Thornhelm, Larkspur House, and the ancient offices guarding the crown's ceremonial authority. She asked no public questions and made no dramatic declarations. Yet every clause limiting interference, every safeguard protecting Alaric, and every deadline forcing action carried the unmistakable discipline of the Duchess of Ferngate. Edmund had asked her privately to answer one dangerous question. Could preparations for a future coronation begin before abdication without creating a rival court around Alaric? A rival court meant a second center of royal power forming around an heir while the reigning monarch still ruled, a risk that could divide loyalties before any transition occurred. Her task was precise: keep the king sovereign, give the prince enough operational authority to prepare, and stop competing households from exploiting the uncertainty. Rosalind sat alone in a records room, comparing different drafts of the ceremony. Her anger surfaced when she found provisions allowing ceremonial advisors to overrule Alaric on decisions involving Ren and Callum. The future king's wife and son were not side issues. Their roles would shape public trust, family stability, and the emotional tone of the next reign. Isolde confronted her in a private corridor before the final papers were sealed. She asked whether Rosalind had helped exclude her household from the process. No spouse should control the next sovereign's coronation, Rosalind answered, regardless of history, rank, or personal sacrifice. Isolde stepped closer. You have written me out. Rosalind closed the file in her hands. No, I stopped anyone from writing themselves in. She had already secured written agreement from the High Chaplain's office, senior constitutional advisors, and the Coronation Authority, the body managing the ceremony's legal and ceremonial structure. Their support made Edmund's framework difficult to reverse once a signature was added. Rosalind inserted one final condition herself. Alaric's coronation oath would include a personal promise of transparency, restraint, and service. It was a direct answer to the rivalry that had forced the document into existence. Alaric now understood why his aunt mattered. She held the knowledge needed to activate the entire plan, making her the bridge between his father's reign and his own. But once the palace discovered how much power had shifted, loyalty began turning into panic. By the following morning, offices were being reassigned. Names were disappearing from confidential lists, and the queen consort finally understood what the document had taken from her. The secret remained hidden from the country, but inside the palace its force was immediate. Doors that had always opened without question now required written authorization. Advisors who had expected years of influence found their names missing from the new coronation structure. Isolde received a formal notice confirming that Alaric, not Edmund's household, would decide who stood closest to the throne on coronation day. Alaric moved quickly. He suspended the existing coronation planning group and ordered a full review of its members, finances, ceremonial assumptions, and private communications. Wren was added to the supervisory council, while Rosalind became transition chair, creating a new center of authority around the direct line of succession. Isolde read the notice alone. She removed her glasses and remained motionless while an aide waited for instructions. Then she asked whether Edmund had approved the wording. The answer came quietly. The king had signed it himself. Isolde felt more than exclusion. She felt judged. Years of public service, loyalty, and sacrifice had been reduced to a fear that she might interfere with Alaric's future. Edmund visited her later. He could not promise to restore her influence, because the framework had been designed to protect his son from competing households. "You protected Alaric," she said, "by humiliating your wife." She slid the notice across the table toward him. Edmund did not pick it up. The monarch kept his hand still as silence widened between them. She finally turned the document face down, and that small gesture changed the argument. This was no longer only about ceremony. It had entered their marriage. Rosalind uncovered the reason for the urgency soon afterward. A documented review of private messages showed several courtiers discussing how to preserve their positions after Edmund's reign. She removed their names from confidential lists, proving that the king's fears had not been imagined. Alaric then discovered something worse. One proposed arrangement would have delayed Wren's full ceremonial recognition, while expanding Isolde's advisory role during the first year of his reign. The future king understood that informal promises had already become tools of pressure. He ordered every transition decision to be recorded in writing. No whispered agreement, private assurance, or household understanding would survive without proof. The old palace culture had ended in a single command. Yet victory brought no peace. Alaric remained disturbed by what the decision had done to his father and stepmother. Late that night, he asked Edmund to meet him somewhere without files, officials, or royal offices between them. There was no throne room, no secretary taking notes, and no document waiting for another signature. Edmund and Alaric met in a small private room at Everholt Farm after midnight, each arriving without an aide. For the first time since the order was signed, they spoke not as sovereign and heir, but as two men shaped by duty, loss, and years of conversations postponed until the crown made honesty unavoidable. Alaric had chosen Everholt because it belonged emotionally to his father, not institutionally to the monarchy. The house carried Edmund's private memories, far from the pressure of Thornhelm and the machinery surrounding the crown. Both men agreed the signed order would remain in force, but the prince insisted they understand its meaning before the kingdom was asked to accept it. Edmund poured the tea himself. His hand shook slightly, and a few drops spilled onto the saucer. He looked down, laughed once at his own unsteadiness, and the sound broke the tension more effectively than any prepared apology could have done. Alaric admitted he had first read the document as a loss of faith, a belief that his father no longer trusted him to choose when he was ready. Edmund answered with painful honesty. He had feared asking openly, worried his son might refuse out of loyalty, placing love above preparation and leaving the future exposed again. "It was never meant to replace you," Edmund said, leaning forward. "It was meant to make sure you never inherit the uncertainty I carried into this throne." The monarch had expressed protection through the only language he had ever trusted, duty. Alaric finally understood. The secrecy had wounded him, but the purpose behind it was not rejection. His father had tried to secure the road ahead before fear, rivalry, and grief could block it. Alaric reached into his coat and placed his signed acceptance beside his father's teacup. "I will do it," he said, "but we do it honestly." The king rested one hand on the page without looking down. Alaric then revealed his first decision. The ceremony would honor Edmund's service while openly recognizing his late mother's influence on the man who would one day be crowned. He would not erase either parent to protect the other. He also asked his father to remain publicly beside him throughout the preparation period. Their unity would prevent the transition from appearing like rejection, defeat, or an internal overthrow. Edmund agreed to announce the framework himself. Secrecy had protected the order, but continued silence would now damage the crown. By morning, the palace was preparing the statement, unaware of how quickly the news would spread across the kingdom. At 6 in the morning, the palace released a statement unlike anything Aldermere had expected. King Edmund had authorized formal preparations for Prince Alaric's future coronation and granted his heir immediate control over the ceremony. Within minutes, broadcasters abandoned their schedules. Crowds began forming outside the palace gates. The secret was no longer a family burden. It had become a national moment of judgment. The palace confirmed that the signed document prepared the path toward Alaric's crowning, while Edmund remained on the throne. The statement stressed that no abdication had occurred. The king was still sovereign. The prince was simply being given authority to shape the ceremony before the moment arrived. The announcement called the decision planned continuity, not crisis. Yet its timing made that language difficult to control. Aldermere had never been asked to watch one reign openly prepare the ceremony of the next, and speculation spread immediately about whether unity had survived inside the palace. Commuters gathered around newsstands reading in stunned silence as phones began ringing and strangers quietly repeated the same question. Why now? A national broadcaster described it as the first coronation ever planned by a reigning monarch for his own successor. Alaric watched the report with Wren and their children. Young Callum noticed his father's photograph beside a crown and asked whether everything would now change. The prince hesitated. Wren answered first, telling their son that the family would remain together, even as she exchanged a worried glance with her husband. Crowds gathered outside the palace by mid-morning. Some cheered Alaric's readiness. Others held photographs of Edmund and applauded the monarch for defining the succession before uncertainty could divide the kingdom. Support for the son did not erase loyalty to the father. For many, both emotions existed at once. The palace then released one controlled detail. Alaric would redesign the coronation around public service, modern representation, and reduced royal excess. The ceremony would still be sacred, but it would speak to a nation demanding restraint. Isolde appeared beside Edmund during a brief public departure. She ignored shouted questions and kept her composure. Her silence suggested acceptance. Yet the new hierarchy was unmistakable. Now the king and his heir had to stand together and explain whether the document represented decline, division, or renewal. When Edmund and Alaric finally stood together, there was no announcement of defeat, no forced farewell, and no struggle for possession of the throne. The king spoke first, acknowledging that a monarchy survives only when duty is prepared before crisis demands it. Then Alaric stepped forward, not as a son replacing his father, but as an heir publicly accepting the burden his father had chosen to place in trusted hands. Edmund confirmed that he would continue serving as sovereign while Alaric led the coronation preparations and assumed wider responsibilities across the monarchy. The father was not being removed. The son was being prepared with clarity before uncertainty could return. Edmund explained, through the formal address, that the secret document had been created to protect constitutional continuity, the stable and lawful passage of royal authority from one reign to the next. It would prevent private competition, silence rival households, and ensure that Alaric inherited a defined structure rather than a palace already fighting over his future. Edmund then lifted the original sealed copy and handed it to his son before the cameras. Alaric accepted it with both hands, turned toward his father, and bowed. The gesture honored the sovereign, but it also honored the man whose painful decision had made the transition possible. Alaric thanked him publicly for choosing preparation over pride. His words ended the belief that the document had been designed to reject Edmund or force him aside. The future king made the truth unmistakable. His father had not weakened the monarchy by planning ahead. He had strengthened it. Wren stood beside Alaric as an equal partner in the new framework. Callum watched nearby, seeing succession presented not as sudden loss, but as responsible preparation. The princess understood that her husband's rise would change their family, yet she also knew secrecy had finally given way to trust. Isolde accepted that she would not control Alaric's coronation or shape his future court. She still carried the pain of exclusion, but she chose not to challenge the signed order. Her restraint ended the internal struggle, and preserved the dignity that open resistance would have destroyed. Rosalind stepped away from the transition chair once the structure was secure. She had never sought personal power. She had protected the transfer of authority, blocked those trying to exploit it, and returned control to the rightful heir. Alaric's signed acceptance was placed beside Edmund's signature in the royal archive, turning the order from a father's command into a shared promise between two generations. The secret signature had stunned the kingdom, but its final meaning was unmistakable. Edmund had not surrendered the crown. He had secured its future by entrusting it with open eyes to his son.